She fell through the cabin door into the dark. Her hand went down to push herself up and sank into something warm and wet that was not water. Slowly, she lifted her palm into the firelight. It was black with blood. Around her, four giant men lay dying on the floor. And she, a mail-order bride who had just been betrayed with $3 to her name, who had never held a surgeon's needle in her life, was the only chance they had to see the morning. This is the story of the night that changed 5 lives forever in the heart of the Wind River country. The October wind came down from the Wind River range like a knife, and it carried the smell of blood with it. Wendell Hawthorne tasted that smell in the back of his throat as he ran. His boots broke through the crust of fresh snow, sinking ankle deep. With every stride, and behind him he dragged a sled lashed together from pine boughs and rawhide. On the sled lay his brother, Cassius, unconscious. His face the color of candle wax, a dark stain spreading slow and patient across his shirt where the bullet had gone in just below the collarbone. Wendell did not look back. Looking back was for men who still believed in mercy, and Wendell Hawthorne had buried his belief in mercy 7 years ago in a Kansas churchyard beside a woman named Winifred and a little girl named Prudence. Behind him, somewhere in the timber, an arrow whispered through the air and struck a tree with a sound like a fist hitting wood. Then came the crack of a sharp's rifle, sharp and final, and a man screamed. Briar was still alive. That was something. Wendell pulled harder on the sled traces. The cabin was 3 miles up the ridge, 3 miles through snow that was already deepening, 3 miles with 2 brothers bleeding and 1 brother fighting a rear guard against 12 men who wanted them dead for reasons that went back 28 years and had never once involved them. 12 men sent by Mordecai Vane, who had waited a lifetime to collect a debt no living Hawthorne had ever signed. Rourke groaned on the sled. The youngest of them, 25 years old, his belly opened up by a pistol ball and his lips going blue. Wendell did not have time to check him. He did not have time for anything except the next step and the step after that and the step after that. He crested a ridge and the cabin came into view through the falling snow, low and dark against the timber, smoke rising thin from the chimney. Home, or what they had instead of one. A few minutes later, Briar came in behind them, limping an arrow shaft snapped off in his hip, his bow gone, his face a mask of frozen blood. Wendell got the door barred and threw the bolt. Then his knees gave out, and he sat down hard on the floorboards beside his brothers, and the 4 Hawthorne men bled together in the dim light of a dying fire, and the wind outside began to howl with the first true blizzard of the year. The cold open ended there. The blood went on. 3 days later, a Union Pacific train hissed steam into the gray sky above a place called Hollow Pine, Wyoming Territory, and a young woman named Adelaide Ashford stepped down onto the platform with a worn carpet bag in one gloved hand and a folded letter in the other. She was 22 years old. She had traveled almost 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never seen. She wore a deep burgundy traveling dress that had once been very fine and was now very dusty. The high collar showed the delicate hollow of her throat where a small gold locket rested. Inside the locket were 2 daguerreotypes faded and water-spotted of her father and mother, who had died within 4 days of each other in the yellow fever summer of the previous year. Her honey blonde hair was pinned up in a modest twist with soft tendrils escaping around her face from the long passage. Her eyes, when she lifted them to look around, were the color of cornflowers in late summer, and they held the careful, wary courage of someone who had nothing left to lose and was therefore not yet afraid. The town of Hollow Pine spread out before her in the chill afternoon light, and it was nothing like the letters had described. There was no white-painted church with a steeple. There was no proper main street with respectable shops. There was a muddy thoroughfare rutted by wagon wheels and frozen now into hard ridges. There were false-fronted saloons leaning against each other for support. There were men in heavy coats and shapeless hats who watched her pass the way wolves watch a deer at the edge of a meadow, and Adelaide felt a sudden small shudder pass through her shoulders that had nothing to do with the cold. She had been raised by Reverend Edward Ashford in a tall, narrow house in Boston, where the parlor smelled of beeswax and old hymnals, and her mother Margaret had taught her to play the parlor piano and to mend a tear so finely that no one could tell. Her father had taught her to read scripture in the morning and to recite it from memory in the evening, and he had taught her that the Lord places strangers in our path so that we might learn the shape of his mercy. When her parents died last summer, the house and what little remained had passed to an uncle in Hartford who closed the door in her face and informed her that a Christian charity hospital might have a use for her. She had $800 of debt and no living kin who would acknowledge her. She had sold the piano. She had sold her mother's silver. She had sold the wedding ring her father had placed on her mother's finger in the year of our Lord, 1854. And then in a back issue of a matrimonial paper passed to her by a kind older woman at the boarding house, she had found the advertisement of one Silas Crow of Hollow Pine, Wyoming territory, who wrote that he owned 300 acres of good grazing land and a frame house with 4 rooms, and who sought a refined Christian woman of good family with whom to share his prospering frontier life. She had written. He had written back in a neat hand full of scripture and gentleness. He had sent the train fare. He had sent a small brass ring on a string and asked her to wear it until he could replace it with gold. She wore that ring now around her neck, beneath the high collar of her dress, and the brass had begun to leave a green mark on the skin of her collarbone. Adelaide approached a man who was sweeping the boardwalk in front of a low building with the words Pritchard and Son Provisions painted across his false front in faded white letters. He was an older man, 60 perhaps, with a face like cracked leather and eyes the color of a winter sky. He looked up at her and stopped sweeping. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said. "I am looking for a Mr. Silas Crow. I believe he is expecting me." The old man did not answer at first. He looked at her gloves. He looked at her carpet bag. He looked at the brass ring she did not know was visible above her collar where she had pulled at it during the long ride. His mouth tightened. "Come inside, miss," he said. "Come inside out of the wind." His name was Henry Pritchard, and the inside of his store smelled of coffee beans and saddle leather and the iron tang of new horseshoes. He sat her down on a barrel by the stove, and he poured her a cup of coffee, black as river stone, and he took off his hat and held it in both hands, and then he told her the truth. Silas Crow did not own 300 acres. Silas Crow did not own 3 feet. Silas Crow was a card cheat and a liar and a procurer of women, and in the past 2 years, he had brought 3 other young women to Hollow Pine on the same false promise. 2 of them had taken the next train back east, ruined in reputation, if not in fact. The third, a girl from Pennsylvania named Effie, had walked into the Sweetwater River one cold April morning and had not walked out. Adelaide held the coffee cup and felt nothing. The room was very quiet. Outside somewhere, a horse stamped in its traces. There was more, Henry Pritchard said. There was worse. Silas Crow had run out of Hollow Pine 6 days ago in the dead of night, owing $1,500 to a man named Mordecai Vane. Vane was the worst kind of trouble this side of the territorial line. A man who ran cattle and women and stolen gold dust from a stronghold up near the Sweetwater, a man who had killed more men than the smallpox. To buy off his debt, Crow had sold something to Vane that did not belong to him. He had sold the location of a cabin up on Whitetail Ridge, where 4 brothers named Hawthorne lived alone in the timber, and he had sold the route they would take to bring down their summer's gold from a placer claim at Eagle Pass. The Hawthorne brothers had ridden into an ambush 3 days ago. No one in town had heard from them since. Most folks supposed they were dead. Adelaide set the coffee cup down on the head of the barrel. Her hand was steady. She had not known it could be steady. "How much money do I have, Mr. Pritchard?" she said quietly, "to my name." He looked at the small leather purse she had set on the counter. "I would say about $3.50, miss. And the next eastbound train." "April, miss. The pass closes inside of 2 weeks. We are at the end of the season." She nodded once. She did not cry. The crying, she thought distantly, would come later when there was time for it, and there might never be time for it, and that was perhaps a mercy. "And Mr. Vane," she said, "if he learns I'm in Hollow Pine, will he have an interest in me?" Henry Pritchard's mouth did something that was not a smile. "Miss Ashford, Mordecai Vane has been waiting 12 days for a young woman to arrive on the Union Pacific. He has men in this town. They have been watching the platform. They will know your name by supper time. He will use you to draw out the hawthorns if any of them are still alive, and he will use you for other purposes if they are not. Outside, the wind shifted and threw a handful of snow against the window glass. I see, said Adelaide Ashford. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Pritchard. She had no idea where the steadiness was coming from. Perhaps it was her father's voice in her head reading from the book of Esther. Perhaps it was simply that fear Mayu had not yet caught up to her. Either way, she stood up and lifted her carpet bag and walked back out into the cold. A girl was waiting for her on the boardwalk. She could not have been more than 19, with a pale, freckled face and red hair pinned imperfectly under a cheap bonnet, and she wore a thin shawl over a dress that had been mended too many times. She caught Adelaide's sleeve as she passed. Miss, she whispered, Miss, do not go back to the depot. There are two men sitting on the bench by the ticket window. They have been there since the train pulled in. They are Vanes. Adelaide stopped. She looked at the girl. She saw something familiar in the freckled face, some recognition, the look of a person who has also been alone and cold and afraid, the look of a person who has decided in this particular moment to be brave on someone else's behalf. What is your name? Adelaide asked. Pearl, the girl said. Pearl Donovan. I work at the Silver Star up the street. Please, walk with me, slowly. They walked together down the boardwalk. Pearl spoke without moving her lips, much the way a person learns to speak in a town where the wrong word can kill you. There is a cabin, she said, up on Whitetail Ridge, about 5 miles. It belonged to Silas before he ran. I do not believe Vane's men have had the time to ride up there yet. The trail starts behind the livery and follows the creek. If you walk hard, you can reach it before dark. There is a chance it has wood and a stove. It is the only chance you have, miss. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house will not take you in without coin. The hotel is owned by Vane's cousin. The Reverend is on his missionary circuit and will not return until late spring. There is no church here that will hide you. I am sorry. Why are you telling me this? Adelaide said. Pearl did not look at her. Because I came west on a promise too, she said. They reached an alley between the dry goods store and a shuttered assayer's office. Pearl pressed something into Adelaide's hand. It was a folded paper, a map drawn in pencil with a creek and a ridge and a small square at the top. Spend your $3 on a lantern and matches and bread, Pearl whispered. There is an old trapper's knife at the back of Pritchard's for 50 cents. Take it. Do not stop walking. If the snow comes, follow the creek. The cabin sits above it on the north slope. God keep you, miss. And then she was gone, slipping back into the gray afternoon as if she had never been. Adelaide bought the lantern. She bought a small tin of lucifer matches sealed against damp. She bought a hard loaf of brown bread and 2 pieces of dry cheese wrapped in wax paper. She bought the knife, a small thing with a bone handle and a 6-inch blade, and she slipped it into the pocket of her traveling dress where it lay against her thigh like a strange new bone of her own. She had 4 cents left. She gave them to a barefoot child who was watching her from a doorway. She left Hollow Pine with the sun already 3 fingers above the western peaks. For the first hour, she walked well. The trail was clear. The creek ran black and cold beside her, edged with shelves of new ice. She thought of nothing. She put one foot in front of the other. The carpet bag grew heavy and then very heavy, and then she stopped feeling it at all. Somewhere a raven called once and was answered by silence. Then the sky went the color of old pewter, and the wind came up out of the northwest, and the snow began. It did not begin gently. It began as it meant to continue. Within 20 minutes, the trail was gone. Within 30, the creek was a vague black suggestion to her left, and then nothing. The lantern guttered and went out, and she could not light another match against the wind. She was walking by feel now, by the slight grade of the ground beneath her boots, and she did not know any longer if she was walking up or down or around. The snow drove into her face like sand. Her cheeks went numb, and then her nose, and then her hands inside the thin gloves, and she understood with a strange clinical clarity that this was how a person froze to death. Slowly at first, and then very quickly. She fell. She got up. She fell again harder, and a sharp pain went through her left knee, and she lay for a long moment in the snow and considered not getting up. The snow was warm. That was a lie her body was telling her, but it was a beautiful lie, and she was so very tired. Somewhere out in the dark, a wolf began to sing, and another answered it, and she thought of her mother singing hymns in the kitchen of the house in Boston in the year that her father had been so sick with the influenza, and her mother had sung to keep her own fear quiet, and the sound had been the most beautiful sound Adelaide had ever heard. She got onto her knees. She fumbled at her throat and found the small silver cross on its chain, the cross her mother had worn every day of her married life, and she closed her bare hand around it until the cold metal burned her palm. She prayed without words. She prayed the way a child prays, which is to say she simply held on. And then a thread of wood smoke, very faint, found her on the wind. She lifted her head. She breathed in. It was real. It was somewhere ahead of her, somewhere up the slope, to her right, the unmistakable smell of pine wood burning in a stove. She crawled toward it. She got to her feet and fell and crawled again. For 200 yards, she moved by smell alone like an animal, and then her outstretched hand struck rough, peeled logs, and she understood that she had reached a wall. She felt her way around the wall to a heavy timber door. The door was not barred. It opened under her weight, and she fell through it onto a wooden floor. The wind slammed the door shut behind her with a sound like a coffin closing. For a long moment she could not move. She lay on her side and shook with the deep jerking shudders of a body coming out of cold, and her vision came back to her in pieces. The interior of the cabin was very dim. A few embers glowed orange in a stone hearth. The air was warm. The air smelled of wood smoke and tanned hides, and something else, something heavier, sweet and metallic and recent, and it took her a slow moment to understand what that smell was. She put her hand down to push herself up. Her hand sank into something warm and wet that was not water. She froze. She lifted her hand slowly and held it in front of her face in the orange dimness, and her palm was black with blood. Adelaide Ashford did not scream. She did not have the breath for it. She fumbled with shaking fingers for the tin of lucifer matches in her dress pocket, and she struck one against the stone of the hearth, and the small flame leapt up and showed her the room. The cabin was a fortress. Every wall was hung with traps and snowshoes and skinning knives, and 3 different long rifles racked above the door. The roof beams were heavy peeled pine. The floor was hewn plank scrubbed clean, except where it was not clean, and where it was not clean was where the 4 men lay. There were 4 of them, 4 enormous men, and they were dying. The first lay nearest to her, and he was the largest, a giant of a man, with a thick dark beard streaked with premature gray and a face the color of old wax. A bullet had passed through his right shoulder, and a long knife wound ran down the outside of his left thigh, the blood already drying black at the edges and still wet bright red in the center. His breathing was a wet, ragged sound that Adelaide had heard once before in Boston in a tenement when she had carried soup with her mother to a dying ironworker. It was the sound of a man very close to the edge. The second lay a few feet beyond him on a bare hide rug, and the broken shaft of an arrow stood up out of his hip, and there was dried blood at the corner of his mouth. A long, dark braid of chestnut hair lay across his shoulder. A single eagle feather was still woven into it. The third was sprawled half across a homemade sled by the wall, and his head was wrapped in a strip of cloth that had soaked through, and one arm was thrown up across his face as if he had been shielding his eyes from a great light at the moment he lost consciousness. His arms and chest were enormous, the chest of a blacksmith, the burned forearms of a man who had stood for years at a forge. And the fourth, the smallest of them, and still a head and a half taller than any man Adelaide Ashford had ever known in Boston, lay on his back near the hearth with his shirt unbuttoned and a pistol ball lodged somewhere low in his belly. Sandy auburn hair fell across his forehead. His face was the face of a young man 25 at the outside, and he was the closest of the four to death. His lips were already going blue. His breath was so shallow, she thought at first he had stopped breathing altogether. The match burned down to her fingers. She lit another one. She lit the lantern she had carried in. She set it on the heavy plank table in the center of the room, and yellow light filled the cabin, and she saw on that table a Winchester rifle and two heavy revolvers and a broken bow and a folded leather map smeared with blood, and what she at first took to be a letter and what proved to be a letter indeed. She would read the letter later. She would read it that very night. It would change everything she thought she understood about why she was in this room, but that was later. For now, she stood in the small yellow circle of the lantern light, and she looked at four dying strangers, and she understood with perfect clarity the choice that had been placed in front of her. She could open the door behind her and walk back out into the blizzard, and she would be dead inside of an hour. She could stay and do nothing, and by sunrise she would be sharing a cabin with four corpses and any wolves or men who came hunting for them. Or she could roll up the sleeves of her travel-ruined burgundy dress, and she could try. She thought of her father in the pulpit. She thought of him on the last Sunday before he had taken sick, his thin hands gripping the worn wood of the lectern, his voice carrying out across the small Boston congregation. When the Lord places a dying man upon your road, he had said he is not asking you whether you would like to help. He is asking you what kind of soul you are. Adelaide Ashford did not know yet what kind of soul she was. She supposed she was about to find out. She knelt beside the youngest of them, first the one who would die soonest. She put her ear to his chest and heard his heart faint as a moth at a window. She pressed her gloved hand to the wound in his belly and felt the slow, steady welling of warm blood. She said very quietly into the dim cabin, "Do not die. Please do not die. I have come a very long way, and I have nowhere else to go." Then she stood up and she got to work. She built up the fire first. She moved across the cabin and threw fresh split pine onto the embers and blew on them until the flames came up. She found a great iron kettle by the hearth, and she went to the door and braved the wind long enough to scoop the kettle full of clean snow. She set the kettle to boil. She found a wooden chest at the foot of a rough-hewn bunk, and inside it she found clean linen shirts. Half a dozen of them folded with a neatness that suggested a man's careful hands rather than a woman's, and she tore them into long strips for bandages. She found a bottle of rye whiskey on a shelf. She found a small leather kit of needles and sinew thread that a hunter uses to mend hide, and she sterilized a needle in the lantern flame. She started with the youngest because he was the closest to dying. She unbuttoned his shirt with hands that did not feel like her own. The bullet had entered low on the right side of his belly and had not come out. She would have to find it. She had never done such a thing in her life. She had mended a sleeve. She had darned a stocking. Now she was going to put her fingers into the body of a man she did not know, and she was going to bring out a piece of lead, and either he would live or he would die. And either way, she would never again be the woman who had stepped down off the Union Pacific that afternoon. She poured whiskey over the wound. The young man's whole body bowed up off the floor, and a sound came out of him that was not quite a scream, and his eyes flew open. Whiskey, amber eyes, with all the youth burned out of them by pain, and they fixed on her face for one long, unfocused moment before they rolled back. She used a small pair of fire tongs, heated and cooled and heated again in the lantern flame, and she found the ball, and she brought it out, and it fell onto the floor with a small, dull sound. She poured more whiskey. She packed the wound. She bound it tight. He was still breathing. That was the only thing that mattered. She moved to the second man, the one with the arrow in his hip. The arrow had broken off cleanly. She would have to push the rest of it through because to pull it back would be to drag the barbed head through muscle a second time. She did not know that until she examined the shaft and saw the way the fletching was set. And then she knew it the way her grandmother had known the weather by some sense she had not realized she possessed until the moment it was needed. She did what had to be done. The man with the eagle feather in his braid woke once during it and spoke to her, but not in English. He spoke in a language she had never heard, soft and slow, and his dark amber eyes looked at her without seeing her and saw something else instead. And he said one word 3 times that sounded like a name. And then he said in plain English, "White Spirit, you came." And then he was gone again. She moved to the man with the head wound. She unwound the soaked cloth and saw that the wound was wide, but not as deep as she had feared, a hard blow rather than a killing one. And she cleaned it and she stitched it closed with the bone needle and the sinew thread, and her hands worked of their own accord, and she did not weep, not yet. She came last to the largest man, the bearded one. The one she would later learn was named Wendell, the one who had dragged the others home. She unbuttoned his heavy wool shirt and she eased it down off his shoulders, and she saw a body that told the story of a war. There were old scars on him, long and pale, the kind a saber leaves. There was a puckered, round mark across his ribs that could only have been made by a bullet that had passed close enough to graze and not close enough to kill. There was a knife line down his jaw that was so old it was almost silver. And there were the new wounds, the through-and-through hole in his shoulder still oozing dark, and the long, deep slash across the meat of his left thigh that had laid the muscle open to the bone. She poured the whiskey, and he did not move. She felt for the small pulse at his throat, and it was there, slow and stubborn, and refusing to go out. She threaded the needle a second time, and she began to sew the long wound on his thigh closed, and she had set 6 stitches when his hand came up off the floor, as if it had a will of its own, and closed around her throat. His eyes were open. They were the color of cold steel after a long winter. They were not seeing her. They were seeing some other place, some other ambush, some other woman who had come into his house with a knife in her hand. His grip was the grip of a man who had killed before and would kill again, and the air went out of her in a thin, frightened gasp. She did not fight him. She could not have fought him. He was 3 times her weight. She let the needle hang from his thigh by its sinew thread, and she lifted her free hand slowly and carefully and laid it flat against the wrist of the hand that was crushing her throat. She tried to speak and could not. She tried again. "I came to help you," she whispered. The words were almost no sound at all. "By Christ, I came to help you." His eyes traveled down her body, slow and unfocused, and they found the small silver cross that hung at the hollow of her throat just above his thumb, and something behind them changed. The killing left him. Confusion came into the steel gray eyes, and then a kind of terrible grief. And then his hand fell away from her, and his head fell back against the floor, and he was gone again into whatever dark place he had been sent. Adelaide did not move for a long moment. Her hand went up to her own throat. She could feel where his fingers had been. She could feel where the bruises would come up by morning. Then she picked up the needle and she finished the stitching. 20 stitches in all. She bound the thigh tight. She bound the shoulder. She sat back on her heels and looked at the 4 men she had sewn back together, and her hands began at last to shake, and she pressed them flat against her apron knees and made them stop. She crawled across the cabin to the hearth. She added more wood. "Shall take a man." She sat with her back against the warm stones of the chimney, and she looked at the heavy plank table where the lantern still burned, and she saw the folded letter she had not yet read. She crawled to it. She unfolded it. The paper was stiff with dried blood at one corner. The handwriting was small and neat, and she knew it instantly because she had received 11 letters in that same hand over the course of the past summer. The letter was from Silas Crow to Mordecai Vane. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time slowly because the room had begun to tilt around her. "Mordecai, the mine sits at Eagle Pass on the second creek above the fork. The hawthorns will come down with the season's gold and the original survey map on the 14th. They run light and they run fast, and they will not expect company. I have drawn the cabin location at Whitetail Ridge on the back of this paper. Take what you want. Burn what you cannot carry. The mail order woman arrives on the 17th, and I will deliver her to you in person if the rest of this miscarries. Consider my 1,500 fully discharged, and add the 200 ounces we agreed. Your servant, S. Crow." She set the letter down on the table very gently as if it might break. She had not been ruined by Silas Crow. She had been used. She had been a piece on a board. She had been the second card in a hand he had been planning to play, whether the first card won or lost. He had sold these four men to die. He had sold her into worse than death. He had taken the train fare she had borrowed against her father's good name, and he had put it on the table at a faro game, and he had written her letters of scripture in gentleness while he plotted murder. She did not weep. The weeping had still not come. She looked across the cabin at the four men who lay in the wavering orange light, and she thought very clearly, "You will live, all four of you. I do not yet know your names, but you will live because Silas Crow wagered that you would not, and I am done losing on his account." She got up. She put more wood on the fire. She melted more snow. She washed the blood from her hands in a tin basin. She took off her travel-ruined burgundy dress and hung it over a chair to dry, and she put on a man's flannel shirt she found in the chest, the sleeves of which fell down past her fingers, and she rolled them up to her elbows and went back to her work. The blizzard outside howled on through the night and into the next day and the next. For 4 days the wind did not stop. For 4 days Adelaide Ashford did not sleep more than an hour at a time. She fed the fire. She melted snow for water. She found a sack of oats and made thin gruel and spooned it past cracked lips a drop at a time. She changed bandages. She kept watch on chests for the race infall of breath. She prayed without words because words had become too heavy to carry. On the second night, the man with the eagle feather woke once and looked at her with clear, dark amber eyes and said in plain English this time, "You are real." "I am real," she answered. He closed his eyes. "Good," he said. "Good." On the third night, the largest man, the one with the steel-gray eyes, came up out of his fever long enough to mutter two names she did not know, Winifred and Prudence, and her hand went to his forehead, and she found it burning, and she sat with him through the worst of it, and she did not let go of his hand, even when his fingers tightened on hers, hard enough to bruise. On the fourth morning, the youngest of them, the boy with the belly wound and the whiskey amber eyes, opened his eyes and looked at her where she had finally fallen asleep, sitting up against the chimney stones, her face streaked with soot and old blood, her honey blonde hair come down out of its pins and falling around her shoulders. "Are you," he whispered, "are you an angel, miss, or am I dead at last?" Adelaide woke at the sound of his voice. She looked at him, and her composure broke at last, and tears came down her face in a slow, steady fall that she could not have stopped if she had tried. "I am no angel," she said. "I am only an abandoned bride who lost her way in the snow." The young man, whose name she would soon learn was Rourke, smiled faintly. It was the smile of a man who has seen the inside of his own grave and decided he is not yet finished with the world. "Then we are uncommonly lucky men, miss," he said, and he closed his eyes again, and he slept the first true sleep of his recovery. The wind dropped on the morning of the fifth day. Sunlight came in through the small, frost-rimmed window of the cabin, clean and pale and merciless, and it lay in a long, bright bar across the floorboards, where 4 days earlier there had been only blood. Wendell Hawthorne woke first. He woke the way a man wakes who has been waking from ambushes all his adult life, instantly, and without sound, his eyes going to the rifle rack above the door before they did anything else. The rifles were where they belonged. The bar was thrown across the door. The fire was burning steadily, banked properly, the way a man who knows wood banks a fire. There was a kettle on the hob. There was the smell of oats cooking. There was a young woman asleep in his rocking chair beside the hearth. She was small. That was the first thing he saw. She could not have weighed 100 pounds. She wore one of his shirts, and the cuffs of it were folded back almost to her shoulders, and her hands lay folded in her lap, and her hands were chapped and stained brown with old blood that had not all washed away. Her face was turned toward the fire. Her hair, which must once have been very fine, was a tangled, honey-colored mass around her face. There was soot on her cheek. There was a small bruise at the corner of her jaw that he did not at first remember giving her. There was a silver cross at her throat. He did not know her. He had never seen her before in his life, and she had clearly been the only thing standing between him and the cold ground for the better part of a week. He looked across the cabin. Briar lay awake on the bear hide, watching him quietly, the eagle feather still woven into the braid that had come half undone. Briar lifted one finger slightly, the old hand sign from when they had been boys. The sign that meant, brother, all is well here. Wendell sat up. The thigh wound caught him with a wave of nausea. He let it pass. He looked at Cassius, who was breathing deep and even in his sleep, and at Rourke, who was breathing shallow but steady. He looked back at the woman in the chair. The woman opened her eyes. They were the color of cornflowers. They went very wide for a moment when she saw him sitting up, and then she did something that Wendell Hawthorne would remember for the rest of his life. She did not run. She did not flinch. She did not cower. She stood up out of the rocking chair. She smoothed down the borrowed shirt. She straightened her back. "Good morning, sir," she said quietly. "My name is Adelaide Ashford. I am the woman Silas Crow sent for. I found you here 4 days ago, and I have done my best, and I owe you an explanation, and there is something on this table that you must read before you decide what to do with me." Wendell Hawthorne looked at the small woman in the borrowed shirt. He looked at the silver cross at her throat. He looked at the table where a folded letter sat under the lantern, weighted down by a pistol ball. He did not speak. He could not speak. The name Silas Crow had gone through him like a knife, and behind the knife came the slow, cold understanding of what this small woman had walked into and what she had done in spite of it. Briar spoke instead from the bare hide on the floor. His voice was low and rough. "Brother," he said, "she is the one Wakantanka sent. I have known it since the second night." Cassius stirred and woke and saw her and said simply, "Good morning, miss," as if she had been there all his life. And Rourke the youngest opened his whiskey amber eyes and grinned weakly up at the ceiling and said, "Welcome to Hawthorne Cabin, Miss Ashford. The accommodations are poor, but the company has improved considerable." Wendell Hawthorne reached across the table and picked up the letter. He read it. His face did not change. When he had finished, he set it back down very carefully in the exact place it had been. He looked at Adelaide Ashford for a long moment. Outside, the snow lay bright and clean across the whole of the Wind River country, and for the first time in 4 days, no wind blew at all. And a single raven called once from a ridge pine and was answered by another from very far away. "Miss Ashford," Wendell Hawthorne said in a voice as quiet as the morning itself, "you are not going anywhere. The pass will be closed until April. The man named Mordecai Vane will be hunting you by now in Hollow Pine. You will remain here in this cabin under the protection of the 4 Hawthorne brothers until such time as we can deliver you safely to wherever in this world you wish to go. That is my word. It is the only word I have left worth giving. Do you accept it?" Adelaide looked at him. She looked at his bandaged shoulder. She looked at his bandaged thigh. She looked at the bruise on her own wrist where his hand had closed during the fever, and she looked at the 4 men she had pulled back across a line that very few are pulled back across. "I accept it, Mr. Hawthorne," she said. And outside the cabin, the long Wyoming winter settled down upon them like a held breath. And somewhere far below in the town of Hollow Pine, a man named Mordecai Vane was already saddling a horse. And the second part of the story, which was the longer and the harder and the truer part, had not yet begun. The first rule was made before the sun went down on that 5th day. Wendell Hawthorne sat at the head of the heavy plank table with his bandaged legs stretched stiff in front of him, and his 3 brothers ranged around him as best as their wounds allowed, and Adelaide Ashford stood by the hearth with her hands folded in front of her, the way a schoolgirl stands before a stern master. The lantern between them threw long shadows up the cabin walls. Outside, the cold had deepened into something that had a sound to it, a low, thin singing in the chimney bricks. Wendell did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at his brothers. "Miss Ashford is a guest in this house," he said. "She is not a servant. She is not a hired girl. She is not anything but what she is, which is a Christian woman who walked through a blizzard and saved 4 men who had no claim on her mercy. She will be treated accordingly. No man enters her room without knocking and waiting for her answer. No man speaks rough language in her presence. No man drinks whiskey under this roof except on a Saturday evening, and then only 1 cup, and then quietly. I will shoot the brother who breaks any of these rules. I will shoot him myself, and I will sleep well after." Briar inclined his head once. Cassius said, "Yes, brother." Rourke, who was still too weak to sit up properly and had been propped against a roll of furs, gave a slow, lopsided smile and said, "Anything else, Captain?" "Yes," said Wendell. He turned his steel-gray eyes on Adelaide for the first time. "Miss Ashford, the far corner of this cabin will be yours. Cassius will hang a curtain across it tomorrow, and you will have a bed and a chest and a small lamp. The door of this cabin is barred at sundown and unbarred at sunrise. You do not go outside alone. You do not go down to the creek alone. You do not step 10 feet from these walls without one of us within sight of you. Are these terms acceptable?" Adelaide's voice when she answered was very small but very clear. "They are Mr. Hawthorne, and I thank you." "Do not thank me," he said. "Thank Briar. He is the one who knew you the second night." Briar did not raise his eyes. He was carving something small from a piece of pine. He said only in his low voice, "I knew her the first." That was the night Cassius Hawthorne, who had not slept properly in 5 days, got up from his place by the fire and walked stiffly across the cabin to the corner Wendell had appointed, and he took down a length of clean oilcloth from a peg, and he hung it across the corner with twine and 4 nails before he allowed himself to lie down. He did it in silence. He did it the way a man builds a small church in a country where there has never been one. When he was finished, he turned to Adelaide and said, "Begging your pardon, miss, it is rough. I will do better in a day or two." She looked at the curtain. It was the first private space she had been given in many long days. Her eyes filled. "It is the most beautiful room I have ever been given," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne." "Cassius," he said gently. "Just Cassius, miss. Mr. Hawthorne is the one who shoots people." Briar made a sound that might have been a laugh. Rourke laughed openly, then winced and pressed his hand against his bandaged belly. Wendell did not smile, but something passed across his face that was not quite a frown, and the cabin felt for one small moment like a place where 4 brothers and a stranger might learn to live. In the days that followed, Adelaide came to know the brothers Hawthorne, the way a woman comes to know a difficult piece of music by sitting with it through many quiet evenings until each separate voice begins to declare itself. Briar was the silent one. He was 30 years old, lean and brown as a saddle, and he wore his long chestnut hair tied back with a strip of leather and an eagle feather woven into it. He had been raised until the age of 9 in the company of a Shoshone band that had taken him in after a scarlet fever winter killed his mother and left his father broken. The band had given him back to Captain Josiah Hawthorne when his father was well enough to ride, but they had given him back changed. He moved through the cabin without sound. He noticed things no one else noticed. When Adelaide spilled flour on the floorboard one morning, Briar was on his knees with a cloth before she had set down the sack. He never made her feel watched. He simply was the way the timber outside the cabin simply was, and after a few weeks she found that she could not imagine the room without him in it. Cassius was 28, and he was the broadest of them. The muscle of his arms and chest built up by years at a forge fire, his hands so large they looked clumsy until you watched them work, and then they were the hands of a surgeon. He had warm hazel green eyes and a way of smiling that began at the corners of his mouth and traveled up. He had been the one who built Adelaide's curtain on the 5th night, and on the 7th, he built her a small wooden stand for her hairbrush. And on the 9th, he came in from the lean-to, carrying a tiny iron rose he had hammered out of a horseshoe nail no bigger than her thumbnail. "For your hair, miss," he said, and his big shoulders went red across the shoulders. "It is a poor thing, but it is the only rose that will grow in these mountains until June." She pinned it in her hair that night, and Cassius would not look at her at supper. And Wendell saw it and said nothing, and Briar saw it and said nothing, and Rourke saw it and grinned at his oldest brother and said, "It would seem the blacksmith has made his offering, Captain. The rest of us had best step lively." Rourke was the youngest, 25 years old, sandy auburn hair, always falling into bright whiskey, amber eyes, a charming half-smile that he had earned by surviving 4 years as a Texas Ranger before he came home to the Wind River country. He healed slowest of the four because his wound was the worst, and so, for the long weeks of November, he was the brother Adelaide spent the most hours beside. She read to him from her father's small leather Bible because he asked her to, and when she had finished the Psalms one cold afternoon, he asked her shyly if she happened to know any of the poems of a man named Walt Whitman. She did not. He asked Wendell to fetch a small, worn book down from a shelf, and that was how Adelaide Ashford came to read aloud the Song of Myself in the long blue afternoons of an early Wyoming winter, while a wounded Texas Ranger lay propped on a bear hide and listened with his eyes closed and a quiet smile on his young, hard mouth. "I think your father would have approved of him, Miss," Rourke said one afternoon when she had finished. "My father would have called him a pagan," Adelaide answered. "Well, Rourke said, Mr. Whitman would have called your father a brother, so perhaps it would have evened out." She laughed, then a small, soft sound she had not made in a great while, and Wendell, splitting kindling outside the cabin door, heard it through the wall and stopped his axe in mid-swing and listened until it was done. Wendell was 33. He was the eldest and the heaviest of them, and the most quiet and the most still. He carried himself the way a soldier carries himself, even 10 years after he has put down his rifle. Shoulders square weight even on both feet, eyes that took the measure of a doorway before they took the measure of a man. He had been a captain of Union cavalry at the age of 18 at Gettysburg. He had been a United States Marshal at the age of 22 in the Bleeding Country along the Kansas border. He had married a woman named Winifred in the summer of his 23rd year, and a daughter named Prudence had been born to them the next March. And 4 years after that, when he was away in Topeka chasing the last of Quantrell's men had ridden up to a small frame house and burned it with his wife and his child inside it. Adelaide learned all of this on the 8th night when his fever came back. It came back hard and sudden, the way a river comes back over a low bank. By midnight, he was burning his sheets, soaked through his teeth, clenched against the chills, and Adelaide left her own narrow bed and pulled on a wool shawl and went to him without a thought. She sat on a low stool beside his bunk, and she pressed cool, damp cloths to his forehead, and for 3 hours she sat there and watched him fight through it. Around 2 in the morning, he began to talk. He was not awake. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing her. He was somewhere in another year in another house, and he spoke to that house in a low, broken voice. He said the name Winifred over and over. He asked it where the child was. He said, "Do not open the door. Sweetheart, do not open the door. Hold the baby. Hold her. Get under the bed. I am coming. I am riding. I am only 20 miles. Hold on." He wept without sound. The tears came down the sides of his face and into his beard, and he did not know they were there. Adelaide held his big hand in both of hers. She did not speak. She did not pray aloud. She prayed inside her own chest. She prayed for a man she had known 9 days and felt as if she had known her whole life. When the gray light came up in the window, he came back to himself. He blinked once slowly, and his eyes found her face, and he understood where he was and what he had said, and a deep and terrible shame moved across his features. He pulled his hand out of hers. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was wrecked. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me no such thing," she said. "I have shouted in this cabin," he said. "I have wept in front of you. I have spoken names that no living man has heard in 7 years. "Mr. Hawthorne," Adelaide said, "I sat beside my father when he was dying of yellow fever. He spoke to my mother for 2 days and a night, and my mother had been dead for 3 days, and he never knew it. I do not consider what a man says in a fever to be what a man says. And the names you spoke are not ugly names. They are the names of a wife and a child whom you have not allowed yourself to mention in 7 years. They needed to come out of you. I am only sorry I had nothing better to offer them than my hand." He looked at her for a long time. He did not speak. He reached out at last, and he took her hand again, very gently this time, the way a man picks up a small bird that he is afraid to crush, and he held it for one long moment, and then he let it go. Her name was Winifred. he said. Our daughter was Prudence. She was 2 years and 4 months old. She had her mother's hair. They were burned alive on the 11th day of June, 1871, while I was riding back from Topeka with a warrant in my pocket that arrived 3 days too late. The men who did it were called Quantrill's Raiders. I found the 11 of them over the next 3 years. I killed all 11. I do not regret killing them. I regret that killing them did not bring back what they took. After the last one died, I took my brothers up into these mountains, and I have not worn the marshal's badge since. And I have not allowed myself to look at a woman with kindness in 7 years. I do not know what to do with the kindness you are showing me, Miss Ashford. I am asking you not to show me too much of it. I am a man with no heart left to give back, and I would not have you wasted upon a ruin. Adelaide listened. She did not interrupt him. When he was finished, she said only this. Mr. Hawthorne, my father once preached a sermon on the Sunday after our parish lost a child. He said that a heart is not a thing that can be ruined. A heart can be wounded, and a heart can sleep, and a heart can refuse for many years to wake. But a heart cannot be ruined. It can only be waited upon. I am not asking you for your heart. I am only asking you to allow it the dignity of waiting. He did not answer her. He turned his face to the wall. But that morning, when she brought him his coffee, he took the cup from her with both hands, and his hands trembled, where they had not trembled an hour before, and he said, Thank you, Adelaide. It was the first time he had used her given name. She did not correct him. She did not need to. November went by like that. The snow deepened around the cabin until the windows looked out at white walls. Briar set snares within 100 yards of the door and brought back rabbit and grouse. Cassius mended every broken handle and hinge in the place. Rourke healed slowly and learned to walk again with a willow stick. Adelaide learned to dress a rabbit to skin it without ruining the pelt, to render fat into tallow, to bake hard biscuit in a Dutch oven over the fire, to load a Henry repeating rifle, and to clear a jam in a Colt peacemaker. Wendell taught her to shoot. He stood behind her in the snowy clearing one cold blue afternoon, with his arms around her to steady her aim, and his beard brushed her hair, and neither of them moved for a long second after the shot. And neither of them spoke of it after. She spilled flour. She wept once quietly in her corner when she came across her mother's silver cross hanging from a peg where she had hung it, and could not remember her mother's face for a moment. Cassius brought her tea. Rourke read her 3 poems by Walt Whitman. Briar said nothing but laid a small, braided sweetgrass bundle at the edge of her curtain that night. Wendell did not come to her, but the next morning he split her firewood for her without being asked, and he stacked it inside the cabin where she would not have to walk in the cold to fetch it. It was on the 12th of December, late at night, that she found the journal. She had been cleaning the cabin while the brothers were out checking traps. She had pulled an old wooden chest from beneath Wendell's bunk to sweep behind it, and the chest was unlocked, and the lid had fallen open a few inches, and inside lay an old leather-bound book with the initials J.H. burned into the cover. Captain Josiah Hawthorne. She knew at once that she should not read it. She also knew at once that she would. She carried it to the table. She lit a second candle. She turned the brittle pages with the care of a woman handling a hymnal in a chapel. The hand inside was a strong, hard, slanting hand, and the entries went back to the year 1849. She found the entry that mattered 3 pages from the end. Eagle Pass, October 19, 1850. I shot Ezekiel Vane today. He drew on me. I drew faster, so the law would say. But I had been drinking since noon, and he had been drinking since dawn, and we both knew the claim was his by right of a first discovery, and I knew I was angry at being made to know it. I shot him before he had cleared his belt. The boy was there. He was 8 years old. He was sitting on a flour barrel by the door of the assay shack, and he saw the whole of it. He did not cry. He did not run. He looked at me until I had to look away. His name was Mordecai. The Lord forgive me. I know that he will not. Adelaide closed the book very slowly. She sat at the table with both hands flat on the wood, and she did not move for a long time. She heard the brothers come back. She heard them stamping snow off their boots in the lean-to. She heard Cassius laughing at something Rourke had said. She heard Wendell's heavier, slower step. He came through the inner door alone. He saw her face. He saw the book on the table. He saw the candle still burning beside it. He did not speak. "Mr. Hawthorne," Adelaide said quietly, "you knew." He sat down across from her. He did not deny it. He did not explain. He waited. "All this time," she said, "you knew that your father had killed his father. You knew that the man hunting you is a man who watched when he was 8 years old, your father shoot down his father in a quarrel that should not have ended in death, and you have not told your brothers." "I told Briar," Wendell said quietly. "Briar has known since he was 16. Cassius knows half. Rourke knows nothing." "Why?" "Because Cassius would forgive us anything, and Rourke would forgive me nothing," he said, "and because the truth does not change what we owe. We owe a debt our father made. We have been paying it for 10 years. Paying it how?" He looked at her across the candle. The light caught in his beard and the gray at his temples, in the steel of his eyes. "The gold we take out of Eagle Pass each summer," he said, "we do not keep. We keep enough to feed ourselves through the winter. The rest goes by federal post to a banker in Lawrence, Kansas, who distributes it to the widows and orphans of Union soldiers. 347 of them on our last count. It will not bring back Ezekiel Vane. It will not unmake what my father did. But it is the only kind of restitution a Hawthorne knows how to make. We live up here in this cabin because we have not the right to live anywhere else. We do not marry. We do not father children. We do not make our names known in any town. We are the last of the line, and when we are gone, the Hawthorne debt will be discharged by the simple ending of the Hawthorne blood. That was the agreement I made with myself the day I read what you have just read. That is the agreement my brothers accepted when I told them as much of it as I could bear to tell." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and she walked around the table and she sat down on the bench beside him and she took his big rough hand in both of hers and she said the only thing she could think of to say. "Wendell Hawthorne," she said, "the sins of the father are not the sins of the son. The Lord said so through the prophet Ezekiel, and he said so again through his own son on a hill outside Jerusalem. You have not the right to refuse forgiveness on behalf of a God who has not refused it. You will not stop sending the gold, but you will stop refusing the rest of your life. You will stop. Do you hear me? You will stop." He did not speak. He bowed his head over their joined hands. And after a long time in the small candlelight, the great frame of Wendell Hawthorne began to shake, and Adelaide Ashford put her arms around his shoulders and held him while he wept the second time he had wept in her presence, and the first time he had not tried to hide it. They did not speak of it again. They did not need to. From that night on, something had changed in the cabin, and all four brothers felt it, though only two of them knew its true shape. And outside the wind blew and the snow fell, and the world that had once seemed very large drew quietly down to the size of a single warm room with 5 people in it. Christmas Eve came in clear and very cold, and Adelaide had been planning it for weeks. She had set Briar to gather pine boughs and red rose hips. She had Cassius rig a small rough table with white flowers sacking for a cloth. She had baked honey cakes from a comb Briar had cut down in October. She had pressed her burgundy dress as best she could and pinned the little iron rose in her hair. Rourke gave her his copy of the Walt Whitman signed inside the cover by his old Ranger captain. Cassius gave her a thin band of silver he had hammered down from a single half-dollar coin, plain and smooth and just wide enough for her smallest finger. Briar laid before her a pair of high-beaded moccasins lined with rabbit fur soles double thick, the work of 3 weeks. He said only, "For when the snow goes." She put her face down into her hands and could not speak. Wendell gave her last. He set on the table a long, fine wooden comb, polished with beeswax until the grain of the maple shone like dark honey, and on the back of it, very small, he had carved the letters D.A. She took it up. She turned it over in her hand. She looked at him across the cabin. I have nothing to give you that is the equal of these, she said. But she did. She had spent the long November evenings knitting 4 wool scarves, one for each of them in colors she had chosen by candlelight from the small basket of yarn she had bought the day she sold her mother silver. To Briar, she gave a deep forest green, to Cassius a warm brown, to Rourke a cheerful sky blue, and to Wendell last she handed a scarf the color of a winter night, and at one end of it, in dark thread on dark wool almost invisible, she had embroidered a small, simple cross. For when you remember, she said quietly, that faith is a thing that comes back. He took it. He did not put it on. He folded it once very carefully, and he set it on the bench beside him, and he kept his hand resting upon it for the rest of the evening. When the brothers had at last gone to their bunks, when the fire had burned down to red coals, Adelaide sat by the small window and watched the snow falling slow and steady in the moonlight. She did not hear him come up behind her. She felt him. Adelaide, Wendell said. She did not turn. Wendell, she answered. He sat down on the bench beside him. He did not touch her. He looked out at the snow. I thought my heart had stopped beating, he said. On the 11th of June in the year 1871, I believed it had stopped, and I had made my peace with it. I have heard it again every day since you walked into this cabin. I do not know what to do with that, Adelaide. I am asking you to be patient with a man who is learning to feel a thing he had decided never to feel again. She turned her face to him at last. She lifted her hand and laid it flat against his chest, right over the place where the heart she had been hearing about beat slow and steady under his shirt. I will be as patient as you require, Wendell Hawthorne, she said. They did not kiss that night. They sat for a long time in the moonlight, by the small window, his hand over hers, where it rested on his chest, the snow falling on the Wind River country, a cabin full of sleeping brothers, a candle going out behind them by slow degrees. The fire fell to ash. The great cold wheeled overhead. They did not speak again. The new year came in. January closed its hard fist around the cabin. On the 6th of the month, Adelaide woke with her chest on fire and could not stand, and by nightfall, she was burning with a fever that frightened the 4 brothers more than a war party would have. It was pneumonia. It came on her fast the way it does to a body that has spent 4 months working through sleep it ought to have taken. She lay in her narrow bed behind Cassius's curtain, and she did not know any of them by the second night. Briar put on snowshoes and walked 30 miles in 2 days through deep snow to the winter camp of his old Shoshone band, and he came back with a small leather pouch of dried roots and a bundle of dried sage and a single feather that the old healer had given him with instructions Briar did not translate. Cassius sat by her bed for hours, stoking the small iron stove they had moved into her corner, and he read aloud from her father's Bible because he had heard her read from it to Rourke, and he thought she might know the sound of it through the fever. Rourke, still walking with a stick, climbed up to the loft where he had not been since the ambush, and brought down an old quilt his mother had pieced when he was a child, and he laid it over her gently and tucked it up under her chin. Wendell did not sleep. He sat in the chair by her bed and he prayed. He had not prayed in a great many years. He prayed the prayers his own father had taught him when he was a boy. He prayed them out loud in the small hours of the third night, his voice low and steady, the prayer book in his hands worn smooth at the spine. And on the 4th night, when she stopped shivering and her breathing began to ease, he laid his forehead down on the edge of her quilt, and silent tears fell into the wool, and he did not lift his head until the dawn. She woke on the morning of the 6th day. The fever had broken in the night. She opened her eyes and saw the cabin in the gray dawn light, and she saw Cassius asleep with his head against the wall, and Rourke asleep curled around the iron stove with the Bible still open on his chest, and Briar asleep cross-legged on the floor beside the bed, with one hand resting protectively on the edge of her quilt, and Wendell asleep in the chair, with his head bent forward over her hand, his great rough fingers still wrapped loose around hers. She did not move. She did not want to move. She lay there in the gray light, and she looked at the 4 men who had pulled her back across the line. She had pulled them back across, and she understood at last that she had not come west to find a husband, And she had not come west to find a home. She had come west to find a family. She had crossed half a continent and walked through one blizzard and into a cabin full of dying strangers in order to find a family. And she had found one, and there was no possible road back. A tear came out from under her lashes and ran sideways into her hair. Wendell stirred at her hand and woke and saw her eyes open and made a low sound in his throat that woke the other 3 and 4 giants of men crowded around the small, narrow bed of Adelaide Ashford in the cold gray dawn of the 12th of January, 1879. And not one of them said anything at all because there was nothing in any language that would have been adequate to what was passing between them. She got better slowly. She was up, out of bed by the end of the month. She was walking by Candlemas, and by the middle of February, she was strong enough to stand at the door and watch the brothers split wood in the hard blue light of a winter that was beginning very faintly to think of letting go. It was on the 15th of February that Breyer came in from a trap line checked 3 hours earlier than expected. His face the color of old paper, and laid his rifle on the table without a word. "How many?" Wendell said. "3 sets of horse tracks," Breyer said. 8 miles south. One of them is shade the way the Cheyenne tracker called Black Wolf shoes his horse. He is in Vane's pay. He has been hunting hawthorns since the Powder River summer. He will read these ridges like a book. The cabin went very still. "How long?" Cassius asked. 2 weeks, Breyer said. 3 at the outside. The thaw is coming early this year. They will move with it. Wendell looked at his brothers. He looked at Adelaide. "All right," he said. "Then we will be ready when they come." That night, the 4 Hawthorne brothers and the woman they had unknowingly been waiting their whole lives for sat down at the table and began to plan a war. And Adelaide Ashford, who had come west in October to be a bride, took her place among them as something else entirely. And outside the cabin, the long Wyoming winter began at last very slowly to break. The plan they made that night was the plan of men who had been to war before. Wendell sketched it out with a piece of charred kindling on the back of an old flour sack, spread across the plank table, and the others bent over it in the lamplight, while Adelaide stood at the head of the table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, gone cold. The cabin would be the keep. They would not run because there was nowhere to run. To that Mordecai Vane would not follow. And a man who has waited 28 years does not give up the chase because his quarry has crossed a county line. They would harden the cabin instead. They would turn it into the kind of small, fortified place that 24 men with rifles could not take without losing half their number. Cassius would sheath the inside of the shutters with quarter-inch boilerplate he had been hoarding for 2 years against this very day. He would do the same for the inside of the heavy timber door. He would cut narrow firing slits at man height in 3 of the 4 walls, and he would build a 4th slit low to the floor on the south wall, low enough for Adelaide to lie behind on her belly with a rifle barrel laid across a folded blanket. Breyer would set the ground. He would walk the cabin in expanding circles for 3 days the way he had been taught when he was a boy in the Shoshone band, and he would lay snares in pitfalls and trip lines hung with old elk bells salvaged from the lean-to. He would mark the lanes of fire so that no hawthorn shot would cross another's, and he would mark the lanes of approach so that they would know which way the killing was likely to come from before it arrived. Rourke would take the high tree. There was a tall lodgepole pine on the north edge of the clearing that gave a clean field of view down both approaches to the cabin, and Rourke had climbed it as a boy and could climb it again now even with his half-healed leg. He would carry the long Sharps rifle with the brass tang sight, and from that tree he would in his own quiet phrase account for whoever needed accounting before they came within pistol range of the people he cared about. Wendell would hold the door. He would hold the door because he was the eldest, and because he had held doors before, and because if the door went, the cabin went, and so the door was where the eldest brother stood. He would have the Winchester repeater across his knees and his old army Colt at his belt and the Bowie knife of his father in his boot, and he would not move from that doorway until the fight was over or until he was dead. Adelaide would load. That was Wendell's word, said quietly without looking at her. "You will sit at the center of the room behind the trestle," he said. You will keep 3 rifles loaded at all times, and you will keep the spare cylinders for the revolvers wet packed and capped. You will hand them to the man who calls for them. You will not leave that trestle until I tell you to leave it. You will not look out the slits. You will not approach the door. You will keep loading until there is no one left to shoot or no one left to shoot for. Do you understand? I understand, Adelaide said. And there is one more thing, Wendell said. If the door goes, if the cabin is taken, there is a trap door under the 3rd floorboard from the hearth. Briar dug a crawl space under it last summer. You will go down through that trap door. You will not argue. You will not wait. You will go down and you will pull the trap closed above you, and you will lie still in the dark until the shooting is over. If we have won, one of us will come for you. If we have not won, you will wait until the 2nd night, and you will come up at moonset, and you will run east along the creek, and you will find Pearl Donovan at the Silver Star in Hollow Pine. She helped you once. She will help you again. She nodded once. She did not trust her voice. For the next 12 days, the cabin became the workshop of a small army. Cassius's hammer rang from before sunup until after dark, the iron plate hot, riveted to the inside of the shutters. The firing slits cut clean through the seasoned timber and lined with strips of soft pine to muffle the sound of rifle barrels being shifted in the dark. Briar walked his circles. He came back in each evening with snow caked to his moccasins, and the look of a man who has been listening to the country talk to him, and he would sit down by the stove and sharpen a snare wire and say, "There is a draw on the west side that they will use if they have any sense. I have it ready." Rourke climbed his tree 3 times to test the field of view with snow on the boughs and snow off them. And on the 11th evening, he shot a coyote at 300 yards with the sharps as a private superstition. And he came back into the cabin with a long rifle slung across his shoulder and a quiet look in his whiskey amber eyes that none of them had seen in him since Texas. Adelaide loaded. She loaded over and over. Wendell sat with her at the trestle on the 7th evening and walked her through it, the lever of the Winchester, the breech of the sharps, the cylinder of the Colt, the wet packing of the spare cylinders against the cold, making the powder unreliable. And she did each thing and did it again and did it again until her hands knew the work without her mind. She did not weep. She did not flinch. She listened to him the way a soldier listens to the man who is going to keep her alive. And at the end of the evening, Wendell laid his hand flat on the table in front of her and said, "You were not raised for this, Adelaide. I am sorry." "I was raised for whatever is asked of me, Wendell," she said. "I was raised by a Christian father in a Christian house. We did not get to choose what would be asked. We were taught only to be ready when the asking came." He did not reply. But that night he laid his old army coat across the back of her chair before he went to his bunk, the heavy blue wool of the Union cavalry, and she found it there in the morning and understood it for what it was. It was on the 20th of February, with a thin, warm wind in the timber that meant the thaw was coming early, as Briar had said, that Adelaide went down to the creek to fetch water. She did not go alone. Rourke went with her, his sharps across his back and a Colt loose in his belt, and he walked 20 paces behind her along the trampled path because she had asked him not to walk beside her because she said she needed 5 quiet minutes in her own company before the world ended. They did not see the 3rd man. Black Wolf was not with the main party of Vane's riders. He had come ahead 3 days before. He had moved through the timber the way Briar moved, and he had not crossed any of the snare lines because he had read the pattern of them and walked between. He was 30 feet up a deadfall on the high side of the creek path when Adelaide came down to it, and he took Rourke first because Rourke was the danger. There was no sound. A loop of braided rawhide came down out of the deadfall and caught Rourke around the neck, and the Cheyenne tracker came with it all his weight, and Rourke went down sideways into the snow with the wind and the cry. Both knocked out of him at once. The sharps fell from his back. A second man rose up out of the brush on the far side of the path, a heavy-set man named Buck Reeves with a scarred mouth and a pistol already in his hand, and he was on Adelaide before she had fully understood that Rourke was no longer behind her. He clamped one hand across her mouth from behind. He hissed in her ear, his breath sour with whiskey, "Walk, Boston. walk and live, scream and die. The barrel of the pistol pressed against her ribs through the thick wool of her coat, and his arm around her waist was thick as a log, and he turned her and began to march her down the creek path away from the cabin. She walked. She walked because the pistol was in her ribs, and because she could see out of the corner of her eye Rourke struggling under Black Wolf in the snow, and she did not want them to put the second pistol into Rourke as well. She walked. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. She thought of what Breyer had taught her about the human body, where it was strong and where it was weak. She thought of the small two-shot Derringer that lay in the boot beneath her left foot, the one Rourke had given her in her second week at the cabin, the one she had practiced with under Wendell's eye 3 afternoons in a row in the small clearing behind the woodshed. 11, 12, 13. She let her steps drag. She let her shoulders sag. She let a small, frightened, pleading sound come up out of her throat, the kind of sound a Boston bride from a parsonage might make. And Buck Reeves heard it and grunted in satisfaction and let his grip on her waist relax by 1/4 of an inch. It was enough. She dropped her right hand. She bent at the knee just enough to clear the boot. Her fingers found the small bone grip of the Derringer and brought it up out of the boot, smooth as if she had been doing it for 20 years instead of 3 afternoons, and she did not aim. There was no time to aim. She brought the muzzle in and pressed it against the meat of his thigh and pulled the trigger. The little gun went off with a flat, hard bark muffled by the wool of his coat, and Buck Reeves screamed and let her go, and she spun under his arm and brought the second barrel up at the level of his belt and fired it into him from a foot away, and he went down sideways in the snow, with both hands clutched at his groin and his pistol fallen out of his fingers. She did not stop to watch him die. She turned and ran. Behind her on the high side of the creek path, Black Wolf saw the running woman and made the decision a tracker makes in 1/4 second. He let go of the half-choked Rourke. He reached for the long knife at his belt. He went after the woman because the woman was the prize, and the woman was the message, and the woman was what he had been sent to take. Adelaide ran up the trail toward the cabin. She had gone 20 paces when something caught her left arm above the elbow with a cold, hard pressure that turned an instant later into a deep and terrible fire. She did not understand at first that she had been cut. She thought she had been struck. She kept running. She felt her sleeve fill with warm wetness. She heard behind her a soft, fast set of footfalls in the snow that were not her own. She ran, she ran, she ran. The cabin clearing came up in front of her in a dazzle of low afternoon sun on snow, and she saw the door of the cabin standing open, and she saw Wendell standing in the door with the Winchester already coming up to his shoulder, and she saw his eyes find the man behind her, and she did the only thing she could think of to do. She threw herself flat into the snow. The Winchester barked once over her head. It barked once and once only because Wendell Hawthorne at 30 yards with a steady rest only ever needed the once. Behind her, there was the sound of a body coming down hard into the snow, and then nothing. She lay where she had fallen. She felt hands lift her. She felt the world tilt. She felt herself carried into the cabin and laid on the trestle table, and she felt her sleeve cut away, and she felt cold whiskey poured over the long, shallow knife wound that ran from her elbow up to her shoulder, and she heard Cassius say very softly, "It is not deep, brother. It is not deep. She will keep her arm." She heard Breyer at the door say, "Rourke is coming up. He is on his feet. He is going to be very angry with himself for the next month." She heard Wendell somewhere very close to her ear say her name once, and she heard in his voice a thing she had not heard in any man's voice since her father's, which was the sound of a love that was no longer trying to hide what it was. She opened her eyes. She looked up at him. "I obeyed the order, Wendell," she whispered. "I came back to the cabin." "You did better than obey it, Adelaide," he said. His voice was rough. "You came back to the cabin with 2 of Mordecai Vane's best men down in the snow behind you. You came back to the cabin a soldier." She tried to smile and could not quite manage it. She managed instead to close her hand around his where it rested on the table beside her face, and he turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers, and they did not let go for a long while. That night, after Cassius had stitched and bound her arm, and Briar had brewed her a Shoshone tea that put her into a deep sleep for 16 hours, the four brothers sat around the trestle and looked at one another in the lamplight, and Wendell said quietly, "He will come now, within the week. He will not wait for the full thaw. He has lost his tracker, and he has lost his outrider, and he will know that he has lost the surprise. He will come with everyone he has, and he will come fast, and he will come tomorrow or the day after." Briar said, "Let him come." Cassius said, "We are ready." Rourke said nothing at first. He was sitting with his back against the chimney stones and his head bowed forward. When he spoke at last, his voice was very quiet. "I let her walk in front of me, Captain." "Stop," Wendell said. "I let her walk in front of me. She asked me to, and I let her. I should have known that a tracker like Black Wolf would have come ahead. I have failed her brother, and I have failed you, and I have failed our father, and I have failed the badge I used to wear in Texas, and I do not know how I will look at her in the morning." Wendell crossed the floor and stood over his youngest brother. He put his hand on the crown of Rourke's auburn head. He spoke in the voice he had not used since their father had died, the voice of the eldest, the voice of the captain. "Rourke Hawthorne," he said, "she is alive. Her arm is whole. The two men who took her are dead in our snow. You walk back into this cabin under your own power with the marks of a Cheyenne rawhide loop on your throat. You have failed nothing. You have done what soldiers do, which is to come home from a bad action and prepare to do better in the next one. Do you understand me?" Rourke nodded without lifting his head. "Do you understand me?" Wendell said again. "I understand you, Captain," Rourke said. "Then go to your bunk and sleep," Wendell said. "Tomorrow you will climb your tree before dawn, and you will sit in it all the next day, and you will not come down for any reason short of the cabin burning. We need a sharpshooter in that tree. We have one. Sleep." Rourke went. Briar went. Cassius banked the fire and went last with one hand on his eldest brother's shoulder for one long, quiet moment as he passed. Wendell sat alone at the trestle for a while. Then he rose and walked across the cabin to the curtain in the corner, and he stood outside it, and he said quietly, "Adelaide," she was awake. The Shoshone tea had not yet taken her under. She said very softly, "Come in, Wendell." He pulled aside the curtain and ducked his head under the low beam and sat on the small stool at her bedside. The single candle in her corner lit one side of his face and left the other in shadow. She lay on her good side with her cut arm laid carefully across the quilt. He looked at her bandaged arm, and then at her face, and then at the small silver cross that lay against the white linen of her nightdress at the hollow of her throat. "Adelaide," he said, "and there is no certainty that any of us will be alive at this time tomorrow. I know Wendell. I have something I have not said. I have not said it because I was afraid I had no right. I find tonight that I no longer care whether I have the right. I find that I would rather say it and be wrong than not say it and be killed. Say it then." "I love you," Wendell Hawthorne said. "I have loved you since the morning of the 9th of November when you set my coffee cup into my hand without a word. I have loved you every day since. I will love you tomorrow whether I am breathing or not. I am asking you, Adelaide Ashford, if we are still alive on the other side of this fight, to do me the honor of marrying me. I am asking it now because I want the asking on the record. I want you to know it before the shooting starts. I want it to be true on the day after whether or not I am there to make it true." Adelaide looked at him in the candlelight. She had been waiting for that moment in some quiet part of herself for a very long time, and when it came at last, she found that she did not need to think about it because the answer had already been written. "Yes, Wendell," she said. He bent his head down. He brought his forehead to rest very lightly against hers. He did not kiss her on the mouth. He kissed her once on the brow, gently, the way a man kisses something sacred. He stayed like that for a long moment, his breath slow and steady against her cheek. "As soon as the Reverend returns from Cheyenne," he said, As soon as the Reverend returns, she answered. He rose. He pulled the curtain closed behind him. He went back to the trestle and sat down and laid his head in his arms, and he did not move again until the gray came up in the small cabin window. The 14th of February dawned cold and very still. There was no wind. The sun came up over the eastern ridge clean and pale, and the snow lay smooth and untracked across the clearing. And inside the cabin, the four brothers and Adelaide moved through their preparations with the calm of people who have already decided not to be afraid. At 9:15, Briar came in from his last walk of the perimeter. He laid his rifle across the table. "They are coming," he said. 12 riders. They have a wagon. The wagon has something covered with canvas that I do not like." "Gatling," Wendell said quietly. "Yes," said Briar. "A small one, hand crank." Cassius said only, "Then we will give it something to chew." Rourke went out the door without a word and crossed to the lodgepole pine and went up it like a boy. The Sharps rode his back. He had a leather pouch of 40 cartridges at his hip. He settled into the high crotch of the tree, and he became very still, and from the cabin, he was no more than another knot in the bark. Adelaide took her place at the trestle. 3 rifles in front of her loaded, 2 spare revolver cylinders at her left hand, a small pile of patched bullets at her right, the blue cavalry coat of Wendell across her shoulders. A horseman came out of the timber at the south end of the clearing first. He was not Mordecai Vane. He was another rider sent ahead under a strip of dirty white cloth tied to a stick. He drew rein at 50 yards and he called out across the snow. But he never finished what he had been told to call out, because before he could speak the third word, a second horseman broke from the timber behind him at a hard gallop. Hatless coat flying, both hands held high in the air, and the second horseman was a man Adelaide had not seen since the morning Henry Pritchard had told her the truth about him. It was Silas Crow. He rode straight across the clearing through the snow, and he reined his exhausted horse to a sliding halt 30 feet from the cabin door, and he threw himself out of the saddle into the snow, and he fell down on his knees with his hands still high and his face white and gaunt, and his lips cracked from days of hard riding. "Hawthorne," he shouted at the cabin door. "Hawthorne, do not shoot. Hawthorne it is. Silas Crow and I have come to settle my account with you and with God in that order. Vane is 2 miles behind me. He has the Gatling and he has 12 riders behind him, and he means to burn this cabin to the foundations with everyone in it. I have the route he means to take, and I have his order of battle, and I will fight beside you, and I will die beside you if it is what is asked. Open the door, Hawthorne. Open the door and let me make what little amends a man like me can make." Inside the cabin, no one moved. Wendell stood in the door slit with the Winchester held level. His finger lay alongside the trigger guard. He was still as carved oak. Adelaide rose from the trestle. She walked across the cabin to where her husband-to-be stood at the door, and she laid her good hand on his arm. "Wendell," she said quietly, "he is the man who tried to sell me to a brothel. He is the man who tried to sell you to your grave. I have no love for him. I will have no love for him on the day I die. But my father preached that any man may be granted a chance to die better than he lived. Grant him the chance. If it is a trick, we will know it inside the minute. If it is not a trick, we will need every rifle we can get. Grant him the chance, Wendell, for my father's sake, for your own." Wendell looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the door 6 inches, and he said in a voice that carried across the snow, "Crow, walk in, hands high. The first wrong move, and my brother in the tree will put a sharp's ball through the back of your skull. Do you understand?" "I understand, Hawthorne," Silas Crow said. He did not lower his hands. He walked across the snow on his knees the last 6 feet, and then he rose and he came on his feet to the door, and he stepped into the cabin, and the door shut behind him. Cassius gave him the Henry repeater and a belt of 50 cartridges. Briar gave him a place at the south wall slit. He did not speak to Adelaide Obegduas. He looked at her once. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been running for a great many days. He looked at the ground. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly, "I will not ask anything of you. I came up the trail to ask one thing of your husband. and I have been granted it. I am sorry, it does not undo, but I am sorry." She did not answer him. There was no answer she had to give. A few minutes after 10 in the morning, Mordecai Vane and his men came out of the timber on the south side of the clearing. There were 11 of them on horseback. The 12th man drove the wagon, and on the wagon the canvas had been thrown back, and on the bed of the wagon stood a small, bronze hand-cranked Gatling gun, 10 barrels, and a rack of brass loading hoppers behind it. Vane himself rode at the head, a thick-chested man of 37, with a long, pale scar that ran from his left temple down through the corner of his mouth and gave his face a permanent look of cold, private amusement. He wore a black frock coat over a brocade vest. He carried no rifle. His pistols were holstered. His hands rested loose on the pommel of his saddle. He drew rein at the same 50 yards his outrider had used. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the small column of wood smoke rising from the chimney. He smiled. "Hawthorne," he called out across the snow in a voice as comfortable as a man addressing a Sunday gathering. "I have ridden a long way to keep an appointment my father made 28 years ago. I would prefer to keep it without burning your house. Send out the woman, send out the gold. Walk out yourselves with your hands empty, and I will give you a fair count of 3 before we begin. That is more grace than your father showed mine on the morning of the 19th of October, 1850. You have until I count to 20. The count begins now." Inside the cabin, Wendell Hawthorne looked at his 3 brothers and at the man who had betrayed them and at the woman he was going to marry. He looked at each of them in turn. He took up the Winchester. "Brothers," he said quietly, "make it good." He worked the lever once. The bright brass cartridge sprang up into the breech. He set the muzzle into the firing slit. He laid his cheek to the stock. Out in the clearing, Mordecai Vane raised his right hand in the cold, pale February sun, and he began to count. Adelaide Ashford bent her head once over the loaded rifles on the trestle. She did not pray for victory. She prayed for steadiness. She prayed for the 4 brothers and the 1 repentant man, and she prayed for the little iron rose still pinned in her hair, and she prayed for the wedding she had been promised, and then she lifted her head and she put her good hand on the lever of the spare Winchester, and she waited for the first shot to come. Up in the lodgepole pine on the north edge of the clearing, Rourke Hawthorne settled the brass-hanging sight of the sharps onto the throat of the man cranking the Gatling, and he let out a long, slow breath, and he let half of it back in, and his finger took up the slack of the trigger. The sharp spoke first. It spoke from a quarter-mile away with the deep, flat authority of a .50 caliber round, and the man at the crank of the Gatling gun lifted off the wagon bed as if a great hand had taken him by the chest, and he came down in the snow 10 feet behind the wagon and did not move again. Mordecai Vane had not yet reached the count of 7. Vane did not flinch. He did not even turn his head. He simply lowered his counting hand, and he said to the rider at his right in a voice still pleasant, "Burn it." And then the 11 horsemen broke apart the practiced way of men who had ridden together before, and they came down on the cabin in 3 converging lines, and the Gatling, after the briefest of pauses, began again under the hand of a second man, and the morning came apart. The Winchester at the door slit barked. A rider in the lead of the western line came out of his saddle and went down under his own horse's hooves. The Henry at the south slit barked twice in close succession, and Silas Crow, his face the color of wet paper, worked the lever and fired again, and a man in the southern line dropped his rifle and clutched at his throat. Briar at the east slit had no Winchester. He had his bow. He had carried it from a winter cache under his bunk that very morning. He drew it now full draw, the cedar wood creaking, and he loosed an arrow that crossed the clearing on a flat, hard line, and took the man at the Gatling crank for the second time through the side of the chest below the arm, and the gun fell silent again. Vane wheeled his horse. He shouted something Adelaide did not catch. 2 of his riders peeled off and came around the west side of the cabin at a hard gallop, jumping their horses over Briar's first snare, missing the second by inches, and the third caught the trailing animal across the chest and brought it down in a tangle of legs, and screaming, and a man pinned beneath 600 pounds of dying horse. The sharps spoke again from the high pine, and the horse stopped screaming, and so did the man. Cassius worked the bellows of the cabin's defense like the bellows of his own forge. He moved from the door to the south slit to the hearth and back to the door, and at each station he set down a ready rifle and took up another, and he said over his shoulder to Adelaide, "3 rifles, Miss Ashford, 3 rifles, brother. Needs another." And Adelaide handed them across with hands that did not shake because she had not given them permission to shake. The Gatling came back to life a third time. A new man had crawled up behind it from the lee side of the wagon. He cranked it with the desperate energy of a man who knows he will not get a second chance. The 10 barrels began to spin, and a stream of hot lead ripped across the front face of the cabin at chest height, and a length of timber above the door blew apart in splinters, and one of the iron-sheathed shutters rang like a struck bell, and Wendell at the door slit did not move. He laid his cheek to the stock. He waited for the muzzle of the Gatling to dip a quarter-inch as the gunner exhausted his hopper. And in that quarter-inch, Wendell Hawthorne put a Winchester ball through the gunner's eye. The Gatling fell silent for the third and last time. Vane saw it fall. He saw what no other man on the field had yet permitted himself to see, which was that this fight was already lost. He did not retreat. Mordecai Vane had been 28 years preparing this morning, and he was not a man who retreated. He drew his pistols at last. He kicked his horse. He came straight for the cabin door at a flat gallop, his black frock coat flying behind him, both pistols up his scarred mouth, pulled back from his teeth in something that was not quite a smile. Silas Crow stepped out from the south wall. He did not run. He did not crouch. He walked out the cabin door past Wendell with the Henry repeater hanging at his side and a strange settled peace on his haggard face. And he walked 4 paces into the open snow, and he raised the rifle to his shoulder, and he shot Mordecai Vane's horse cleanly through the head at 30 yards. The horse went down. Vane went over its neck and rolled in the snow and came up with one pistol still in his hand, and he saw who had shot his horse, and he fired twice from the ground, and both bullets took Silas Crow high in the chest. Silas Crow sat down slowly in the snow as if he were sitting down at the end of a long day. The Henry rifle slipped from his hands. He looked across the clearing at the cabin door. He nodded once very slightly, the way a man nods when an account has been settled. Then his head went down onto his chest, and he did not move. Wendell Hawthorne came through the cabin door at a long lope. He did not have the Winchester. He had the heavy Bowie knife of his father in his right hand and the old army Colt in his left, and his wounded leg did not slow him at all. Mordecai Vane saw him coming. Vane fired the second pistol once, twice, 3 times, and the third shot took Wendell across the meat of his upper arm and spun him half around, and he came back square, and he kept coming. Vane was out of cylinder. He threw the empty pistol. He drew the long knife from his belt. The 2 men met in the open snow midway between the cabin and the dead horse. There was no quarter in the meeting. There was no science. There were 2 men of nearly equal size and nearly equal age and entirely opposite errands, and they went at each other with the cold, furious patience of men who had been waiting their whole lives for this single morning. The Bowie struck. The long knife answered. They locked. They broke. They locked again. Wendell took a slash across the cheek that opened a line from temple to jaw. Vane took the point of the Bowie through the meat of his shoulder and did not seem to feel it. They went down together into the bloodied snow. Wendell came up first. He came up with his knee planted hard on Vane's chest, and the Bowie at the hollow of Vane's throat, and his free hand pinning Vane's knife arm to the snow. There was a long moment. The cabin behind them was silent. The 2 surviving riders of Vane's western line had thrown down their rifles and were standing with their hands flat on their saddle horns. The man pinned under his dead horse was weeping quietly and asking, "Please, sir, please." Cassius and Briar stood in the cabin door, rifles at the ready. Up in the high pine, Rourke Hawthorne held his sharps on the back of Mordecai Vane's head, finger on the trigger breath, steady. Vane looked up at Wendell. The cold private amusement was still in his eyes beneath all the blood and snow, the look of a man who had spent his whole life expecting exactly this and was almost grateful to have arrived at it. "Finish it, Hawthorne," he rasped. "Your father had the courage. Let us see if his son does." Wendell Hawthorne did not move for a long 10 count. He thought of his father's journal. He thought of an 8-year-old boy on a flour barrel in 1850. He thought of Adelaide Ashford in the cabin behind him, and of the gold he and his brothers had been sending to widows for 10 years, and of the thing his father had said to him once in the last week of his life, that there is a kind of killing that buries a man, and there is a kind of killing that frees him, and that the difference between them is whether the killing is done by his hand or by the law. He took the bowie away from Vane's throat. He stood up. He pulled Vane up after him by the collar of the black frock coat, and he turned him around and he bound his hands behind his back with a strip of rawhide that Briar tossed him from the doorway, and he marched him to the dead horse, and he tied him to the saddle horn so that Vane was forced to stand in the bloody snow next to the animal he had ridden in on. "You will hang in Cheyenne, Mordecai Vane," Wendell Hawthorne said. "You will hang at the end of a federal rope in front of every widow you have made and every orphan you have orphaned, and you will hang with your name read out and your crimes read out and your father's name read out beside them so that the whole of this territory will know where the Vane account ended and where the Hawthorne account ended on the same morning. That is the killing my father could not do. That is the killing I will do for him. May God have mercy on your soul. The territory of Wyoming will not." Mordecai Vane did not speak. The amusement had at last gone out of his eyes. What was left was the look of an 8-year-old boy in a flour barrel, watching the wrong man walk away, and finding that the moment he had been preparing for since 1850 had been taken from him by the very hand he had spent his life trying to bring down. Adelaide came out of the cabin then. She walked past the dead horse and past Mordecai Vane without looking at him, and she went to where Silas Crow sat with his head bowed against his chest in the snow, and she knelt down beside him. She took off her wool shawl and she laid it across his shoulders. She put her good hand under his chin, and she lifted his face. He was not yet gone. His eyes were open. He looked at her, and he tried to speak, and could not. And she leaned her ear close to his cracked lips, and what he said at last in a voice that was almost no voice at all was, "Adelaide Wooden, I cannot undo, but I went out the door. Tell your father. Tell him a man can go out the door." "I will tell him, Silas," she said. "I will tell him myself when I see him." Silas Crow smiled, then a small, thin smile, and his eyes went to the pale February sky above the Wind River country, and he was gone. Adelaide sat with him in the snow for a little while. She did not weep. She closed his eyes with 2 fingers. She drew the shawl up over his face. She got to her feet, and she walked back across the clearing to where Wendell stood with the cut down his cheek, already crusting in the cold, and she put her hand into his bloody hand, and she stood with him in the bright pale morning while Cassius and Briar moved across the field collecting rifles, and Rourke came down at last out of the high pine. The federal marshal at Cheyenne was a man named Halloran, who had served under Wendell in a different war and remembered him. He took Mordecai Vane into custody on the 3rd of March, and he held him in the territorial jail through the spring assizes. The trial began on the 11th of April, 1879, in the courtroom on the 2nd floor of the Laramie County Courthouse. It lasted 4 days. Adelaide Ashford gave evidence on the 2nd day. She stood up in the witness box, a small woman in a plain black morning dress she had borrowed from Pearl Donovan, and she read aloud the letter from Silas Crow to Mordecai Vane that she had carried in her own hand from a blood-smeared table in a cabin on Whitetail Ridge to a federal courtroom in Cheyenne, and she told the story of October to February in a clear, unhurried voice, and when she had finished, the jury did not need to leave the room. Mordecai Vane was hanged on the 17th of April, 1879, on the federal gallows at Cheyenne before a crowd that included 19 widows and 41 orphans whose names had been read out from a list compiled by Wendell Hawthorne and entered into the court record. The Vane account closed at 12 minutes past 10 that morning. The Hawthorne account, having been paid in installments for nearly 30 years, closed quietly the same afternoon. The Reverend Caldwell Hawthorne, who was the brother's father's older brother, and who had not seen his nephews in 11 years, returned at last from his missionary circuit at Cheyenne on the 2nd of May. He came up the rough road to Hollow Pine in a borrowed buggy with his Bible and his prayer book, and the small brass cross he had carried since the year of the war, and he wept openly when he came down out of the buggy and saw his 4 nephews standing in the road of the town to meet him. Wendell Hawthorne and Adelaide Ashford were married on the 15th of May, 1879, in the small whitewashed church at the south end of Hollow Pine that had been built the year before by a Methodist congregation and that had no proper bell yet, but had instead a horseshoe hung from a beam above the door, which Cassius Hawthorne struck with a hammer to call the few who had been invited. Adelaide wore a dress of cream-colored linen that she had cut and stitched herself in the long, quiet weeks of April, and she carried a small bundle of wild blue lupine that Briar had gathered from the south slope at first light, and pinned in her hair was the little iron rose that Cassius had hammered out of a horseshoe nail in the first week of November. Her honey blonde hair was loose down her back, the way her mother had worn hers on her own wedding day in 1854, and her mother's silver cross hung at her throat, and the gold locket with the daguerreotypes of her mother and father lay against her heart, and on her smallest finger was the thin band of silver Cassius had given her at Christmas. Cassius stood as best man. Briar walked her down the short aisle in his clean buckskin coat, with the eagle feather in his braid, and his hand light upon her elbow, and at the end of the aisle he passed her hand into his eldest brother's hand and stepped back without a word. Rourke stood beside Cassius with his Texas Ranger star pinned over his heart for the first time in 2 years. Pearl Donovan, in the only good dress she owned, and a borrowed bonnet, stood as the only bridesmaid, and her freckled face was wet through the whole of the service. Reverend Caldwell Hawthorne read the vows in the old prayer book voice that Wendell had not heard since his own boyhood. When the moment came for the words, Wendell did not look down at the prayer book. He looked at Adelaide. "Adelaide Ashford," he said, "you walked into a cabin full of dying men with a knife in your pocket and a cross at your throat, and you did not walk out. You have given me back a heart I had buried, and a faith I had set aside, and a road I had not believed I was permitted to travel. I take you now to be my wife before God, and before my brothers, and before the country that raised us both, and I will love you, and I will keep you, and I will stand at your door as long as God permits me breath to do so. This is my word. It is the only word I have left worth giving, and it is yours." Adelaide did not weep. She had decided in the quiet of the morning that she would not weep. She lifted her face to him, and she said in a clear, small, steady voice that carried out across the small congregation, "Wendell Hawthorne, I came west to marry a stranger, and I found a family. I came west to find a roof, and I found a hearth. I came west believing my road had ended, and instead I have found it has only begun. I take you to be my husband before the God who set my feet upon the trail to your door, and I will be your wife and your steady hand and the keeper of your house all the days of my life. This is my word. It is done. It is given." Reverend Caldwell Hawthorne pronounced them man and wife. Wendell bent his head down. He kissed his wife once gently in the small Methodist church at the south end of Hollow Pine. The horseshoe rang above the door. The 4 Hawthorne brothers walked out into the clean spring sunshine of the Wind River country, 3 of them with their rifles slung properly across their backs as a guard of honor, and the 4th with his arm around the small, honey-haired wife who had come to them in the worst blizzard of an unkind winter and stayed. In the months that followed, the Hawthorne brothers used what remained of the gold from their last summer at Eagle Pass to buy 600 acres of good grazing land in the long, shallow valley south of Hollow Pine, where the snow melted earliest and the spring grass came up sweetest, and they built a house there, the 4 of them together with timber. They cut themselves in stone. They hauled themselves from a quarry up the creek. The house was not large. It had a parlor and a kitchen and 3 small bedrooms upstairs under the eaves and a long, wide porch that looked west toward the Wind River Range. Cassius forged the hinges and the latches and the iron rooster that turned on the gable. Briar set the foundation stones true. Rourke shingled the roof in 2 long days. Wendell raised the ridgepole. Cassius opened a small smithy at the south end of Hollow Pine, and within the year there was no rancher within 40 miles who would take his horses anywhere else to be shod. Breyer took to breaking and gentling the wild mustangs that came down out of the Wind River country, and his name went out among the cattlemen of 3 counties, and by the autumn of 1879 he had more work than he could do alone. Rourke pinned a new badge to his shirt, that of Deputy United States Marshal for the Hollow Pine District under the federal commission of his old comrade Halloran in Cheyenne, and he rode the long, lonesome circuit of the territory law in winter and in summer with a quiet, competent steadiness that surprised no one who had known him in Texas. Adelaide opened a small dressmaker's shop on the boardwalk 2 doors down from Pritchard and Son Provisions, and she hung a wooden sign above the door that read simply, Ashford Hawthorne, Fine Needlework. By the end of her first summer, she was teaching 12 young women of the town the trade her mother had taught her in Boston, and the first of those young women was Pearl Donovan, who proved to have hands so quick and so accurate that Adelaide put her in charge of the shop within 6 months, and Pearl Donovan married Warwick Hawthorne the next April in the same small Methodist church under the same horseshoe bell. On the 17th of October, 1879, exactly 1 year to the day, after Adelaide Ashford had stepped down off the Union Pacific in Hollow Pine with $3.50 to her name, Adelaide Hawthorne stood on the long, west-facing porch of the new house with her husband's arms around her from behind and his great rough hands resting lightly on the small swelling at her waist, where their first child was already growing, and she watched the sun go down over the Wind River Range in long bands of gold and rose, in a deepening blue that was almost the color of her own eyes. Adelaide, Wendell said quietly. Wendell, do you have any regret? Tell me true. There is still time. There is gold enough into the bank at Cheyenne for the first-class passage to Boston and a small house in any neighborhood you would name, and I would not blame you for it, and I would not pursue you. You crossed half a continent to come to a man who did not exist, and you stayed for a man who was not worthy of the staying. Tell me true. Adelaide leaned her head back against his shoulder. She watched the sun lay a final band of fire along the high snow of the western range. Down in the long grass south of the porch, Breyer was working a young roan mare in a slow, patient circle on a long lead line, his eagle feather catching the last of the light. Cassius's hammer rang faintly from the smithy 2 miles down the wagon road, the sound carried on the still evening air. Rourke and Pearl came up the long, sloping pasture from the creek hand in hand, their voices low and comfortable in the dusk. Wendell Hawthorne, Adelaide said. I came west on a promise made by a liar. I followed it because I had no other promise to follow. The Lord did not keep me from the lie. He let me walk straight into it. He let me walk through a blizzard into a cabin full of dying strangers, and he let me stand over 4 men with a needle in my hand and ask him for a steadiness I had not been given before. I do not believe he brought me to Silas Crow. I do not believe he brought me to Mordecai Vane. I believe he brought me to you and to your brothers and to this porch and to this child, and that he used the lie because the lie was the only road that would have led me here. I have no regret. I have no grief that has not already been answered. I am exactly where I was meant to be. I will be here by the grace of the same God who set my feet upon the trail until he calls me home. Wendell did not answer her in words. He turned her gently in the circle of his arms, and he laid his bearded cheek against the top of her honey blonde head, and they stood together in the long last light of an October evening on the porch of their own house, in their own valley, in their own country, and the sun went down at last behind the Wind River Range, and the first stars came up cold and clear over the long piece of the Wyoming sky. 5 years later, in the last week of October 1884, a small, honey-haired boy of 4 years and 3 months stood with his mother at the foot of a great pine tree on the slope above the original Hawthorne cabin, his small mittened hand in hers, his cornflower blue eyes serious. A simple wooden cross, weathered now to a soft silver, stood at the base of the pine. The name carved into the cross piece read Silas Crow, And beneath it the dates, and beneath those, a single line that Wendell Hawthorne had cut himself with a chisel in the spring of 1879. He went out the door. The boy's name was Edward Prescott Hawthorne, after his mother's father, Edward Ashford, and after his maternal grandmother's Prescott family in Boston. He was loved as one who came after another small child his father had once buried in a Kansas churchyard, a girl named Prudence, whose name his parents had agreed would be given to a daughter if God should send them one, though he was too young yet to be told any of it. He looked up at his mother. He had not yet learned to be quiet at graves. "Mama," he said, "who is the man under the tree?" Adelaide Hawthorne knelt down in the cold, dry grass beside her son. She straightened the blue knit cap on a small head. She took out of her coat pocket a small bundle of dried lupine she had carried with her from the house, and she laid it gently at the foot of the cross. "His name was Silas Crow Edward. He did a great wrong once, a long time ago. He did the wrong to your mother, and he did it to your father, and he did it to your three uncles. And then after a long while of running, he turned his horse around, and he came back, and he stood in the snow with us when the bad men came, and he died helping your father to live so that you and I could stand here today. He was a man who got most of his life wrong, but on the last morning of it, he got it right. That is what the cross says. He went out the door. It means he opened the door and walked out into the cold to meet what was waiting for him instead of staying inside where it was warm." The boy looked at the cross for a long moment. He thought about it. He was 4. Then he said very seriously, "Did God forgive him, Mama?" Adelaide Hawthorne looked up at the pale October sky above the Wind River Range. She thought of her father in his pulpit. She thought of a candle burning at a plank table in a cabin full of sleeping men. She thought of a small, thin smile in the bloody snow. "I believe he did, sweetheart," she said. "I believe that is the kind of work God most likes to do. He waits for a man at the door for as long as it takes, and when the man at last comes out, he is there. Every soul gets to come home, Edward, every single one. That is the long good news, and we do not get to know who hears it last. We only get to remember to leave a little blue flower at the foot of the door in case anyone is watching." She rose. She took her son's small mittened hand again. They stood together for a quiet moment in the cold autumn light. Down the slope from the direction of the original cabin, a long, low whistle came up through the timber, the whistle Wendell Hawthorne used to call his wife and his son into supper. Edward Prescott Hawthorne pulled at his mother's hand. "Papa," he said happily. "Yes, my love," Adelaide Hawthorne said. "Papa, let us go home." And the small honey-haired boy and the small honey-haired woman walked together down the south slope above Whitetail Ridge through the long, pale grass of an October afternoon in the year 1884, the smoke of the hawthorn hearth rising thin and steady from the chimney of the cabin below them. The 4 Hawthorne brothers waiting on the long porch of a house that had been built on forgiveness, the Wind River Range standing white and quiet behind them in the gathering dusk, and the long good news of the country going on, as it does in the lives of those who had been given another road to walk.